Welcome back to Collateral Banter, episode 19, I believe. It's another day after President Trump's State of the Union, which I won't really talk about on this episode, maybe tomorrow, as I have to gather my thoughts. But I want to start off with a statement out to Russia. Russia, if you hear me, I would like for you to find George W. Bush's 22 million emails that went missing from 2003 to 2005, according to the movie Vice. Now, I found that Snopes, a site that verifies accuracy of information, and they say the vast majority of those emails have been found. So that makes me think 80, 90%. So maybe there's a couple million emails missing. I'd be curious to know what's in those missing emails in the millions. Talking about Hillary Clinton's 20,000 emails? I want to know. What were they talking about from 2003 to 2005? Just curious. Well, I am going to talk a little bit about Trump, but I'm going to bring back the conversation I had with my friend Jerry. If people haven't listened, that was episode 18, where I interviewed Jerry and where we talk about French postmodern theorist Jean Baudrillard. One thing he said that I found very interesting was the hyperreal versus the real. This was really interesting to me because Jerry said something to the effect of the hyperreal, the manufactured, media-saturated environment actually leads the real. People in real life follow the hyperreal, okay? They followed media manipulations. Media sanitized in the news, in media and social life, and people begin to replicate that. At least that's what I understood. So that got me thinking that Donald Trump is a reader of Jean Baudrillard because when he talks about the fake news, I think he secretly likes it. By the way, I've read Fire and Fury, and while Trump loves to publicly attack the media, behind the scenes, he's reading the New York Times. He's reading the Washington Post. He is watching TV. They talked earlier this week about executive time, and that it comes out to about, 6 hours a day. Either way, the amount of consumption that Donald Trump does of the media, of what is going on there, Donald Trump's consumption of media, to me, signifies that he wants to see what's happening there, and then, I believe, reacts to it. So in some ways being shaped by what he sees on TV. And I think that's so fascinating. When I find scholars, like I did in the previous episode about Richard Rorty in predicting a Donald Trump-like figure, after talking to Jerry, I found in my book collection, which is massive, I found the book that was actually an interview with Jean Baudrillard called Paroxysm. And Paroxysm was copyrighted in 1998, but you will hear how pertinent it is to 2019. I have to read some of this interview. It's just too good to be true that there are just some French postmodern theorists who could foresee the future of humanity back in 1998 when they were writing and when this was published. And in a world where we find it to be difficult to understand where we are, what is going on, sort of attack on truth, where we are in the world today. I'm looking back and seeing who was writing about society and what seems to be accurate. Now, again, I'm sure there are a lot of authors and scholars who I could look back at and say, wow, they really predicted where we are today. Okay, that's possible. But he really gets to the anthropological and sociological level of the country. Let me just get started here. So I'm going to do some readings and then hopefully get people to read it because actually it's a pretty interesting read. Okay, I'm going to start with terms. So Jean Baudrillard is asked by Philippe Petit a question. What distinction do you draw between the universal and the global? We're clearly talking about that today. Universal, globalization, things like this. So here's what he says. In the global, all differences fade and de-intensify, giving way to pure and simple circulation of exchange. All liberties fade before the mere liberation of exchange. Globalization and universality do not go together. They might be said, rather, to be mutually exclusive. Globalization is the globalization of technologies, the market, tourism, information. Universality is the universality of values. human rights, freedom, culture, democracy. Globalization seems irreversible. The universal might be said, rather, to be on its way out, at least as it has constituted itself as a system of values on the scale of Western modernity, which is something that has no equivalent in any other culture. That speaks right to us today, where I see the political systems of the United States. Donald Trump, in my understanding, absolutely despises universality. To him, I don't think he cares at all about human rights, freedom, culture. Those things don't matter. And here's why. If there's one way to understand Donald Trump, I would argue, and I'd have to go back to my international relations class, is he's a realist. He is an absolute realist, living in an interconnected, globalized world, where I think most of the leaders in America in the last, couple decades have been a bit realist and somewhat of an internationalist. They've been a mix. I think Donald Trump does not care about international institutions unless it furthers America's interest. To him, the international institutions that America at least talks to, negotiates, and often ignores the international institutions. But Donald Trump, in his mind, thinks it's a big waste to go through the international institutions, to have these multilateral organizations, unless it benefits the United States. And that's how realism really works for people. Just explain, realism is this obsession with hard power, military force, with the nation state, and growing the economy at all costs. Really, everything else is secondary or not important, or it's opposed in many ways to achieving your ends, your national ends, and your state-centric ends. It's really international order, it seems a bit dangerous. Now, look, George W. Bush ignored the United Nations when they didn't approve the vote in Iraq and invaded Iraq anyways, and yet he claimed he had an international coalition go into Iraq. But I would argue one of the visions for the liberal order is to institute democracy, and you saw that in the sort of neoconservative movement that believed you can invade and force a country to adopt a democracy, and that if you democratize that region, not now, not in 5 years, but maybe in 25, 30, or 50 years, it would become a beacon of democracy for the region, and you would reduce the number of dictatorships in the region and ultimately diminish the power of terrorist organizations. That's what I have to assume that they believed in. Again, invading a country to implement democracy is an insane idea. A country that posed no threats to the United States did not have the capability, and we know that today. In fact, the Bush administration admitted that so much to that. But I just have to tell people that that's the way he functions. And it's why during the State of the Union, Trump talked about endless wars. We need to end that. Great nations do not go into endless wars, which is hard to disagree with. Although he claimed the country has spent $7 trillion. I've seen figures of $5 trillion. But either way, it's a lot of trillions and a lot of wars. And it's why Trump now, again, thinking of the nation state, thinking of national interest like a realist would. He does not care about pulling out troops, despite the fact that both parties, the elites in both parties, want to maintain the troops abroad. And you can see that in both in the establishment wing of the Democrats and the establishment wing of the Republicans. That's going to be an interesting fight, because I would argue ultimately the establishment is going to fade away. There ultimately will be defeated. So we'll see how that will turn out. But when I read that, I like it when he defined terms, and I really had to begin thinking about what universality means versus globalization. And I thought that distinction was really interesting, because we often conflate globalization and universality. And I think when Baudrillard talks about that, splitting that apart, it fascinates me. And I think it's interesting that he sees the universal as on its way out, that it is actually becoming removed, and these sort of values, human rights, freedom, culture, democracy, hard to say that there is a universal concept that can exist across all countries, across all cultures, right? And yet all countries and all cultures increasingly are globalized in their economy, information, markets, travel, whatever it is that people do. That globalization, the sort of economic globalization, seems irreversible as of today. Although I would argue maybe he's not right about that either. I'll get back to that. Baudrillard was asked another question, and he was asked, what is capitalism for you today? And I thought he gave a really interesting answer. He says, I really don't know. It's sort of a dilution of the universal in a global state of affairs. It's sort of a purely operational general equivalent. It no longer even involves any opposing or negative values, such as revolution or indignity of work. For a long time, the communists proposed an antagonistic system. There's no antagonistic system today, simply because the system itself no longer has any value or gravity. All that remains is an automatic transcription of the world into the global. I gather from that this world that we live in, that increasingly he foresees as lacking sort of these antagonistic opposing values, these conflicts that have existed, no longer exist because global capitalism has won over, has dominated the world, and so it cannot identify itself and has lost sort of values. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but that's what I gather from it. This all came from page 11, but there's another interesting mark he makes about entropy has won. The entropy of the market and democracy, pulling irresistibly towards a generalized exchangism of all values. Hence the wave of revisionism sweeping across the Western world, conscious of this irresistible degradation and tempted, finally, to restore some good old values, to rescue its own identity. Here we have communism at last become a humanism. So here he was asked something very interesting. So he sees two systems, the United States and Europe, and he sees them contaminating each other. He sees that technologies and markets are proliferating around the world, and at the same time, the Western world of technologies and markets in Western Europe also gets pollution, virus, and angst. So what we're getting is when we globalize, we're bringing together all the values, and it's an exchange of values, right? So it's bringing in markets, technologies, new ideas, and yet you're getting something in return, which you might not necessarily like. And so I think he writes here, I think what has triumphed isn't capitalism, but the global, so to speak. And the price paid has been the disappearance of the universal in terms of a value system. We are admittedly seeing a kind of excrescence of human rights and democracy, but only so far as their efficacy has long since disappeared. We're no longer in a power struggle between two systems, but kind of a negative competition to see who will be the first to get their hands on their own values and sell them off. It's a liquidation race. I was fascinated by that. Here's the real issues that I wanted to bring up. And he talks about cultures and identities and values. And I want people to really listen to this because I'm going to go through this rather quickly. But you tell me if this doesn't have values here. Here he's asked essentially about cultures and people. Every culture worthy of the name meets its ruin in the universal. Every culture which universalizes itself loses its singularity and dies away. This is how it is with those who have destroyed by their enforced assimilation. But it's also how it is with ours in its pretension to the universality. The difference is that others died of their singularity, which is a noble death, whereas we're dying from the loss of all singularity, from the extermination of all values, which is a senseless death. So I've been talking about in a lot of episodes about this very issue, about cultures essentially assimilating to one global economic system. What I foresee now in these populist right-wing movements is an attempt at reversing the universality. And they do it through two avenues. First avenue is they actually do propose a statist capitalist market where the government can intervene, maybe give higher wages, maybe prop up state-owned enterprises and businesses. So that's one economic realm. But the second one is to also control who gets in the country, which people get to arrive, who gets to shape what that state is. And I foresee that also as avenue that these right-wing populists, what people call fascist governments are in fact doing around the world. So Baudrillard goes on to say, what becomes globalized is first of all the market, the promiscuity of all exchanges and all products, the perpetual flow of money. In cultural terms, it's the promiscuity of all signs and all values, or in other words, pornography. For the worldwide broadcasting and parading of everything and anything over the networks is pornography. There's no need for sexual obscenity. This interactive copulation suffices. At the end of this process, there's no longer any difference between global and universal. The universal itself is globalized. Democracy, human rights circulate precisely like any global product, like oil or capital. Given all of this, we may ask ourselves whether the universal hasn't not already succumbed to its own critical mass, and if it has ever had anything but lip service paid to it, or found a place anywhere but in official moralities. The increasingly intense resistance to globalization, social political resistance, which may seem like an archaic rejection of all modernity at all costs, have to be seen as harboring an original defiant reaction to the sway of the universal, something which goes beyond the economic and the political, kind of agonizing revisionism in respect of the established positions of modernity, in respect of the idea of progress in history, a kind of rejection not only of the famous global technostructures, but of the mental structures of the identification of all cultures and all continents and the concept of the universal. They can no longer do this, however, as triumphant globalization sweeps away all differences and values, ushering in a perfectly indifferent unculture. And once the universal has disappeared, once the universal is out of the equation, all that remains is the all-powerful global technostructure standing over the singularities, which have gone back to the wild state and have thrown back on their own devices. The universal has had its historical chance, but today, confronted with New World Order to which there is no alternative, with irrevocable globalization on the one hand and waywardness of tenacious insurrections of singularities on the other, the concept of liberty, democracy, and human rights cut at the very pale figure indeed, merely the phantoms of a vanished universal. It's hard to imagine the universal arising from its ashes, or to believe things can be sorted out by the mere play of politics, this latter being caught up in the same deregulation and having barely any more substance to it than the intellectual or moral power. Matters are not, however, finally settled, even if it's now all up with the universal values. In the void left by the universal, the stakes have risen, and globalization isn't certain to be the winner. In the face of its homogenizing solvent power, we can see heterogeneous forces springing up all over, forces which are not only different, but antagonistic and irreducible. So yes, Jerry, my friend, did speak about this resistance coming up, and I want to explore more of it through Baudrillard's writings, and I hope to discuss it in more depth. But I find it to be a really interesting point, that when you take the world as we know it, as we're taught on CNN and other newspapers, you think of the world through the nation-state perspective. You think of nation-states because there's a government, because there's an economy, and you think all of this means you have to analyze the units, essentially, of politics through the nation-state. And I would argue, and along the lines of Baudrillard, that really we have to see politics from I don't want to use the word universal, but from a global perspective. Today, what happens in different parts of the world are perhaps resistance to both globalization and universal. I don't want to just take Baudrillard's words and agree with it and just read them. But for me, it's as we globalize certain values, we lose those meanings where we don't all share a same language. We don't all share a same culture. And yet there's this push about universal values. I want to say that I actually believe in these universal values. I believe countries should be a democracy. I believe in human rights. I believe in these things. But yet, when I say that, and I don't think a lot of people discuss this, am I attacking other cultures, right? Because if I argue that, yes, you should be a democracy, I'm basically telling other people with different histories, different cultures, that they should have a democratic government, right? That their government, let's say it's in Saudi Arabia, or Egypt, I'll just take Egypt, that they should be governed by a democracy, a government that is representative of voters in that country, of the will of the people. That's what a democracy is, right? It's not what it has today. But my point here is the fact that I believe in a universal value, I am dictating to them that their current government is illegitimate, that it does not get any fair election representative of its people. And so what is that? What's the implication of that? That I am, never having been to Egypt, not knowing too many Egyptians, that their government of their country should adopt this universal value of democracy. Is that an imperialistic viewpoint? Now, if you think yes, if you think I am wrong to tell another country how they should live, which is basically Donald Trump's opinion and the opinion of a lot of people today who are against the neoconservatives, then their belief is that other cultures, other countries have their own value systems. They have their own way of running governments, and you should shut up and not talk about it. You don't have any right. You don't know their history. You don't know their culture. You don't know anything about them. Why are you talking about them? You handle your own affairs. They'll handle their own. Now, that's one way to look at it. But then the question for you is to really think about, if that's true, and let's say that culture permits abuses of women, that culture allows, I think it is in the Sudan, which I know is another country, but permits modern forms of slavery. Am I not allowed to condemn that and say that is wrong? And I think this is one critical question we don't ask ourselves enough today. It is, what does this mean? What is this conflict between holding universal values, which I think I've read parts of what Baudrillard believes in, and allowing this single cultural forms to exist around the world, because they are in tension. And again, I don't want to create simple answers. I think that's an episode that I talked about, authoritarianism. That's what a lot of people get into. And I think that that's the world we live in today. People want simple answers, right? Listen, you're not Egyptian. Shut up and leave Egypt alone. You have no right to talk about Egypt. And that's fine. I'm not against people having that value. But certainly, I think there are universal human values. I believe in universal human rights. I believe in universal democracy. Now, that democracy does not need to look like the same. I don't expect the democracy in another country to look like the United States. In fact, I think the best forms of democracy is what Europe has. The parliamentary system, no presidents, the majority in Congress essentially elect the party leader as the prime minister. They govern. The majority of the parliament governs through a parliamentary system. That's what I believe in personally as sort of a universal value. Now, there are many forms and different details, and I won't get into that. But that universal value is very much in conflict with people around the world today, everywhere. And by the way, I was just using Egypt as an example. I could use this in other countries as well. Brazil comes to mind. In today's world, they want to be some evangelical Christian-embedded nation. And they will claim, listen, that's our values. This is Portuguese history. Going back to 1500, these are universal values. They give us meaning. And if you're not Brazilian, why are you telling us how to live? Again, that's ready. And here's what people haven't heard. This is the position of the Russian government, essentially. They want that sovereignty brought back to the local areas. The local governments have that. They want United States great again, and Russia will be great again, right? And that is essentially where it's at right now, is they want these governments to, in some ways, ignore the sort of globalizing factors, which is why I think Russia, Turkey, and other governments, many other governments today, I could list long lists. Those are just the two that came to mind. There's a long list of governments today that absolutely despise the global, and yet they all depend on the globalizing economy for their country. They do spend government funds to prop up allies, friends, state-owned companies that employ thousands and thousands of people who have even hundreds of thousands of family members to depend on if you include all of those employees of state-owned enterprises and factories. And we're seeing this breakdown even of this belief in free markets, which was supposed to say, hey, privatize those state-owned industries. And the sort of right-wing populist governments have said, wait a minute, why should we? We're going to throw out hundreds of thousands of people. What if the private sector doesn't generate the jobs to hire these people? What are tens of thousands of people going to do that are now unemployed and their family members? We're just going to say, hey, the free market and the private sector is going to come in and fix all your problems? I don't think so. At least not in the short term. And that isn't good for these type of governments that very much depend on popular support or manipulated popular support oftentimes. So I think reading all of these responses by Baudrillard, I just began to think about how much there's a conflict between the universal values, which I think a large number of people believe in today, at least a large number of liberals and people on the left, generally speaking, believe in these beliefs. However, oftentimes they could go back, claim not to support these universal values when you see them being abused in other countries. And look, I could talk about countries where women don't have the same rights as men, don't have abortion rights. And in Latin America, there's restrictions on that, but in other countries around the world. And isn't that part of universal values, protecting women from abuse, from being attacked? And you're beginning to see those values, the sort of global values, the universal values that we humanity have, in tension with the local values, the local culture. I'm not as maybe pessimistic as Baudrillard is in how the values are being undone. I actually think the universal values will win. And here's why. Here's the key reason why, before I wrap up. I see the universal values and globalization as intertwined. They're together. They form a nexus that essentially we cannot be separated from. These universal values, human rights, democracy, liberty, all of these things are going to be linked somehow. Maybe this is optimistic, Dan, but these universal values are going to be connected somehow to globalization. Now, we can reshape how globalization is currently worked today, but globalization itself seems currently to be in tension with these universal values. That's how it looks today from certain people's perspective, that there's a tension between those values, between globalization from economic perspective and the universal values. But I think over time, the universal values will come into harmony with global economic powers that exist. And the resistance to that, the modification to economic globalization, will have to come from the people fighting back at certain pockets, in certain areas, in certain spaces, from different cultures, from different backgrounds. They will have to come together using technology, using globalization, languages, social media, to organize themselves to then take actions against the system. But yes, that is at least some of what I read about Baudrillard. I could talk a lot more. We'll see how this goes. But yeah, I think my next episode I will dissect Donald Trump and his prospects for the future. And I want to break down his State of the Union speech in an episode. Why not? Why can't that be my 20th episode? Certainly interesting speech. All right, that is Collateral Banter. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I will continue on and talk more about this in the future. Take care.